got this call that the secretary wants to talk to me and he may ask me to become the superintendent of the Grand Canyon National Park. What do you think? And the next day, I went into the office and found out I had an appointment with Secretary Bernhardt. And the secretary's office, if
Wow.
you've never been in it, it's this huge,
I've
it's a
not.
huge space. It's wood paneled. It has a fireplace. Centered around the fireplace is a couple of sofas and a few overstuffed chairs. He's got his desk. He's got a conference table. It's a really imposing place. It looks very comfortable. It's also very imposing. Through my time in the solicitor's office, I'd been in that office many, many times, including several times where I've had to
Right.
give legal advice to the Secretary of the Interior of the day. And often enough, I've had to say, no, you can't do what you want to do, which is itself a
Mm.
pretty imposing situation. So I'm familiar with the
Yeah.
office. I've been in the office. I was comfortable in the office. But I just want to set that stage.
I appreciate the question though, if I've been in there. I mean, that'd
Yeah.
be cool. Welcome to Who Runs This Park, a podcast where you are invited into the hearts and stories of those who have committed their careers to the protection and preservation of our great national parks. Who Runs This Park aims to be a catalyst for inspiration, highlighting all that goes into managing our national parks and building a sense of appreciation for the invaluable beauty, diversity, and history of our protected lands. Today, we're joined by Ed Keable, Grand Canyon National Park Superintendent, and as he told me before we started chatting, on his 4th anniversary of being asked to be the superintendent. So it's a special day for us to get to be chatting. Ed's experience preceding Grand Canyon Superintendent was as Deputy Solicitor for General Law for the Department of the Interior. The Grand Canyon itself is known worldwide for its expansive vistas. It offers visitors and its display of one of the world's most spectacular examples of erosion, stretching over 270 miles, reaching widths of up to 18 miles, and plunging to depths of over 1 mile. I'm so excited to learn about Ed's heart for stewarding our nation's gem and how his experience brings a unique perspective into park management. Ed, welcome to Who Runs This Park. We're excited to have you
Thank you,
today.
Maddie. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. You've been at the Grand Canyon for almost 4 years. I'm sure there are many different instances that come to mind, but right off the top of your head, are there some experiences that you feel have been unique to your time as the Grand Canyon Superintendent?
Sure. Well, as you can imagine, there are plenty of them. But there
Yes.
was one incident early on in my tenure that I had to play the role of the heavy. We have watering stations. Grand Canyon is in the high desert. It can get quite hot here, so we have watering stations for our visitors to fill watering bottles or take drinks. And one day, as I was walking to work, I came across this gentleman who was pressing his water on the button that pours water out of a spigot and letting the water run over his bald head so elk could drink water by licking his head. And so that's a pretty
Huh.
dangerous experience because elk are wild animals and their hooves can be
Yeah.
really dangerous. If they kick you, they can either break a bone or they can cut you open pretty badly. There were a number of people who were taking photographs and videoing the scene and laughing, but as much fun as everybody
Mm,
was having, it was a really dangerous experience, and it was a
yeah.
bad experience for the elk because if elk are too habituated to humans, they can cause damage, injure people, and sometimes we have to put down wildlife that are dangerous to people. So all in all, a bad situation. So I
Yeah.
had to gently put a stop to all the fun people were having.
Yeah, which isn't the most fun, but it's interesting because there's a few podcasts that I listen to and then in discussions with superintendents. Usually if, for example, I'm thinking more of bears, but if they become food conditioned, they usually have to be either put into a zoo or not. I don't know what the right word is,
Right.
but it's like really hard to enforce some of those things when people are like having fun and all that stuff. But yeah, I don't particularly want to get kicked by an
Yeah.
elk, so I think you probably did the right thing.
Parks are wild places. Many of them.
I
Certainly the
know.
Grand Canyon, we have wildlife here, and we all have to remember that the wildlife are wild and respect them and leave them be.
Yeah, and you're kind of already hitting a current theme or thread that I've seen in some interviews is a lot of the superintendents are wanting to remind folks that like the parks are wild places, and I think we can forget sometimes if we are going say to the Grand Canyon and only going to like the viewpoints and stuff like that. where there are a ton of people, but they are very natural wild places. And especially if you go off the beaten track a little bit, like you're not, I mean, even if you're encountering wildlife in the really busy places, you don't, they are not someone, they're not a
Right.
domesticated pet. So it's
Right.
not, not something you want to play with. So you said you walk to work. I'm curious, do you live in walking
I
distance to your
do. It's about
office?
a 25-minute walk. So I make it a point to
Wow, that's so nice.
I walk along the South Rim Trail to go to work, so it's an opportunity for me every day to see the canyon and to be both inspired by it and also for it to remind me of my responsibilities as superintendent.
That's so
Yeah.
awesome. I used to live in New York, and so I had a couple different situations where sometimes I walked to the subway to then go to work, or sometimes I walked to the office directly from my apartment. But that's another level of a commute, and I like just how it can kind of bring you back down to earth and remind you the beauty, but then, like you said, remind you too that your call in this role is to steward this place for generations to come. So it's I would imagine that's quite humbling
Yeah,
every
it,
day.
it sure is, and breathtaking. Yeah, I tell people that if I ever get tired of seeing the Grand Canyon, it'll be time to leave. But I don't anticipate that anytime soon.
Yeah.
It's just such a remarkable place.
We'll spend some time digging into, especially because I'm just curious, into your like experience as a lawyer and working for the Department of the Interior. But I did read in an interview that it took you about half a second when you got offered the job as Grand Canyon Superintendent to think about it and consider it. So I'd love to hear about that moment, especially as we're celebrating the 4-year anniversary. I'd love to hear about that moment of being offered the superintendency.
Yeah, well, it's a good story. So I had spent the first 2 months of 2020 in one of our regional offices in the office of the solicitor, and I was scheduled to fly through Washington on my way to a ski trip with my husband to Austria. I was going to be in Washington one
Oh,
day, 4 years ago today. And so my boss, the principal deputy solicitor, called me before I boarded the plane and said, "Hey, I think the Secretary of the Interior is going to ask you a question. He wants you to come to the office when you're in town tomorrow." And I said, "Okay, do you know what he wants to ask me?" And he said, "I think he's going to ask you whether you'd like to be the superintendent of the Grand Canyon National Park," which, if you think about it, is the most improbable question. So I got home and I told my husband, I got this call that the secretary wants to talk to me and he may ask me to become the superintendent of the Grand Canyon National Park. What do you think? And he was very supportive and said, if this is an opportunity you want to pursue, I'm very supportive of it. He also told me he wouldn't move to the Grand Canyon and he hasn't. But, we've made that work. And so the next day I went into the office and found out I had an appointment with Secretary Bernhardt. And the secretary's office, if
wow.
you've never been in it, it's this huge, yeah,
I've
it's a
not.
huge space. It's wood paneled. It has a fireplace. Centered around the fireplace is a couple of sofas and a few overstuffed chairs. He's got his desk. He's got a conference table. It's a really imposing place. It looks very comfortable. It's also very imposing. Through my time in the solicitor's office, I'd been in that office many, many times, including several times where I've had
Right.
to give legal advice to the Secretary of the Interior of the day. And often enough, I've had to say, no, you can't do what you want to do, which is itself a
Mm.
pretty imposing situation. So I'm familiar with the
Yeah.
office. I've been in the office. I was comfortable in the office. But I just want to set that stage.
I appreciate the question though, if I've been in there. I mean, that'd
Yeah.
be cool. I have
Yeah.
not yet. I've been in the Oval Office, I will say, because my uncle works in the DC realm and for Homeland Security. And so he, through a connection, I think his neighbor was Secret Service. And so, it's nothing special. It's like an additional tour they
Right.
do of the White House,
Right.
not like, just for us. But that's the closest I've come to the Washington office
Yeah.
spaces. So I appreciate you setting the scene.
Also to set the scene, when you are in the senior executive service, which I was, if the secretary reassigns you, you have two options under law. One is you say yes, and the other is you submit your resignation from federal service. It's a big deal if the Secretary of the Interior reassigns you. The law presumes that senior executive service employees are movable, and we actually don't
Whoa.
move SES all that much, but there's a provision in the law that says that if you're asked, you have to say yes or you have to resign. The secretary
Whoa.
knew that because as his lawyer, I told him that. So he knew that I knew. He knew.
Yeah. He'd been
Yeah, so
reminded
he knew that
before.
I knew that as well. So fortunately, before he asked me that most improbable question, he prefaced it by saying, "I'm going to ask you a question that you can say no to," which I thought was generous of him. So he asked.
How did that work? By giving you the option to say no, did it supersede?
Yeah,
Okay. It wasn't like it was pre an official
right,
order,
right,
I would say.
right. Yep.
Okay.
He was giving me the grace to. Yeah,
Yeah, that is
yeah,
kind.
yeah, it was. I had known Secretary Bernhardt for almost 20 years. He had been my boss and my
Yeah.
client, and we had a very good relationship. So when he asked, I had thought about it. I talked about it with my husband, and I said yes.
And here
And
we
here
are.
we are, 4 years later.
It wouldn't we would not be here if you had said no. So,
Exactly.
and what was the timeline of that transition for you after that?
So he asked me on March 5th, 2020, and I started my official duties on April 26th. The Park
Oh,
Service is,
okay.
yeah,
Pretty quick.
Park Service is part of the federal bureaucracy. It takes time to implement decisions. But, in the meantime, I started talking to colleagues in the Park Service about what they thought I needed to know. I'd started communicating with some people in the park. I was preparing draft all employee messages to introduce myself because, as you can imagine, it's not every day that an employee starts their service in the National Park Service as superintendent of one of the flagship parks like Grand Canyon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for context for folks, I've talked to you'll be the 13th superintendent thus far. And pretty much most folks have worked their way up being in the park service as like a park ranger and stuff like that. And one exception was Suzanne Fleet Green of Lake Clark National Park and Preserve. She actually had come she was chief of staff for the city of Anchorage. But like you're saying, going to the Grand Canyon, to Yellowstone, to Yosemite, it's kind of, you're forging a new path in a sense.
Right.
So an additional reason of being so excited to hear your story and talk to you.
Yeah, I like to tell all my lawyer friends, I'm paving the way for you to be the superintendent of the Grand Canyon National Park.
Fair. You are opening a new door that people
Yeah,
didn't
right.
know. So digging into that actually a little bit, just talking about, it was an improbable question. Can you color some of why you think they chose you as the right person? I know there was some like history within the Grand Canyon. It was a spot they were needing to fill, stuff like that.
So the Grand Canyon Superintendency was vacant for almost 2 years before I got here. The park has had and has a number of challenges. We have and had when I got here $750 million of deferred maintenance. We had the sexual harassment issues on the Colorado River program here in the park.
Mm-hmm.
The Park Service, I was told, advertised this position twice in that 2 years, and nobody in the Park Service applied. And the people who applied from outside of the Park Service were deemed not to have been qualified. So, the Secretary of the Interior has the authority, as we discussed earlier, to reassign senior executives to any senior executive position. So, after the second failed effort to find a suitable superintendent, the Secretary of the Interior at the time, David Bernhardt, thought to himself, who in the senior executive service of the Department of the Interior does he know who would be well qualified for this position? And what he told me that day 4 years ago was, as I thought about that question, he kept thinking about me. Like I said, I'd known him for almost 20 years. We had worked together in different capacities.
Yeah.
And he knew my legal work and he knew my management work. In addition to being a senior career civil service lawyer at the Department of the Interior, I also effectively managed the solicitor's office for a good 17 years before he asked me to come to the Grand Canyon. We worked in some capacities in those areas. And so my areas of legal expertise included those suite of laws within the administrative law area that advise managers on how to manage federal agencies: appropriations law, contract law, information law, personnel law, torts, those sorts of areas of practice. So I was the senior personnel lawyer, the senior contract lawyer, the senior appropriations lawyer in the Department of the Interior. And so I knew the principles of managing federal agencies and implemented them as the manager of the solicitor's office. So I had practical and intellectual experience managing organizations. And the secretary had served under the Bush administration as the solicitor. So we worked together, and he'd seen me operate as a manager and knew I had strong management skills from my time in the Army and other experiences. And he knew my legal background, and in particular,
right.
He knew that I was the lawyer who gave legal advice to Secretary Jewell and Director Jarvis in 2015, 16, and 17 about the sexual harassment issues following the 2015 IG report about sexual harassment in the Grand Canyon. So, and I served in that capacity, in the several capacities, as lawyers for multiple agencies, 7 secretaries of the Interior, all of the bureau directors, right? The Division of General Law supports the legal work of all of the Department of the Interior, all of the 9 bureaus and the Secretariat of the department. So I had served many, many times as legal counsel to the National Park Service. So I had some basic familiarity with that background with the National Park Service and had all of that experience as a manager and as a lawyer for how to run federal agencies. So that, and presumably because he knows me as a person, he determined that I would be well qualified to be the superintendent of the Grand Canyon.
Yeah. And I think, there's a couple things that come to mind. First off, if you had worked together for so long, I think it shows that he thinks very highly of you and is kind of putting you up for this opportunity. And, that means that you and him wouldn't be working as closely together anymore. So that I think is like almost like it makes me think of let the people that you love, like let them go in a sense. But then it's also just it sounds like he had really good confidence of, okay, like honestly, the Grand Canyon, there's a lot of challenges with it from a management perspective. And we need someone who can recreate a space that the beauty of the Grand Canyon deserves. And so as we go further into our conversation, I'm excited to kind of hear over the past 4 years how you've felt that transformation has gone, where you've been putting your focus, how you've been implementing your experience from both a management and a legal perspective into managing the Grand Canyon. But before we go into that, there are a million areas we could go into, but I am curious of, if we take a big step back, what led you to pursue a law degree in the first place? Like, how did you get into law?
Well, my father was a lawyer. He had an office in our home that was my favorite place to play as a child. It had on one wall a series of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and I used to play in there and used to be in awe as a child about how smart he must have been for reading all those books. And so I grew up sort of inspired by that. And then as I grew up and learned better what lawyers do, I saw him helping many clients out of difficult situations in our rural community. Many of his clients couldn't afford his fees, so he would often either waive his fees or he would accept in-kind payments in things like bushels of corn or baskets of zucchini.
That's cool.
So he taught me both the importance and the joy of serving others, and practicing law seemed like a really good way to satisfy that inspiring life mission. And so too, by the way, was military service and managing the Grand Canyon.
Yeah. Did he also have time serving in the Army, or was that kind of a decision you made?
He was in the Army Air Corps at the tail end of World War II, went through training as a tail gunner.
Wow. Yes. Is that kind of in that vein of looking up to him? Did that influence your decision to go into the Army?
That was part of it, but I also, I wanted to serve the country. And as a practical matter, I also just really, I knew at that point, I knew I was going to be a lawyer. And the Army has the JAG Corps affords you the opportunity to get into court fairly quickly. So in fact,
interesting.
I was litigating a criminal case in court within my first week of my first permanent assignment. And usually it takes years for lawyers to get into court. Good. So I knew that the Army would help me jumpstart my legal career. And so that was also one of the reasons. And I also wanted to travel. In my 7 years of Army service, I lived on 3 continents.
Wow. Which continents were you stationed at?
North America in the United States, Asia in Korea, and Europe in Germany.
Wow, that's really cool. Is it similar to ROTC, where you going through law school, the Army is paying for it, and then you're committing to X amount of years of service afterwards?
So I wound up joining ROTC my junior year in college. And so the Army paid for my second 2 years of college. They did not pay for law school. There's a program where they pay for law school, but I didn't enter into that program. So they gave me a deferment to attend law school and then take the bar exam. And if I passed the bar exam, I would have gone to the JAG Corps, which I did. Had I not passed the bar exam, I had to sign up for an MOS, a military occupation series, and I wound up signing up for the Armor Division. So I would have been a tanker had I not graduated law school and passed the bar.
Wow. Yeah. And as I was preparing for this interview, I learned a lot about different areas of the government, candidly, that I didn't know. about as much, and I'm continuing as I have these conversations, I'm learning more and more about the Park Service itself, and so it's cool to kind of expand that knowledge into the Army, into the Department, further into the Department of the Interior. What type of you're serving in court? Who are you representing? Are you representing the Army as the lawyer?
So it depends on what role I'm playing. So in my 7 years, I was mostly a criminal lawyer. At the tail end, I served as a manager of a pretty wide-ranging law office. But I switched between defense and prosecution work and trial and appellate work in my first 5 years. So when I
Okay.
was a defense attorney, my client was a soldier who was accused of crime, and my job was to
Oh,
represent
I
him
see.
or her.
Okay.
When I was on the prosecution side, my client was the United States.
And those two things aren't like when you were representing the defendant, was it always against the United
Yes,
States or was it just dependent?
yes,
Oh, okay. Okay. So you kind of saw both
because it was the United
sides.
States bringing the charges against the defendant.
Oh, okay. Wow. I didn't know. That's interesting that you could be serving as a lawyer for the Army, but be on the defendant side and then have the experience on the other side. So that's really cool.
Yeah, in the Marine Corps, my understanding is you can flip back and forth within the same duty assignment, right? It's just whatever case you have, you might be prosecution, you might be defense. In the Army, you served a term
Interesting.
as a defense, trial, or appellate lawyer, or a different term as government trial or appellate lawyer. And I started out as a defense trial lawyer, and then defense appellate lawyer, and then a government prosecution lawyer.
And the government prosecution was when you were representing the
Yes.
US?
Bringing charges
Okay.
against soldiers who we wound up accusing of violating crimes, and so then it was my job to prosecute them.
And is it a different, if it's in the Army, is it a different court system than like if someone committed a crime outside of the Army and was being
So it
prosecuted?
is a different system. The Army has a military court structure. So the judges are all Army
Okay.
officers, both at the trial and the appellate level, and they're specialized in criminal law, including a special branch of criminal law for military offenses. Congress has passed a special set of criminal laws codified as the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which criminalizes specific military conduct like AWOL, for example. You know, if you're not in the military service, you don't get charged AWOL, but there is a crime of AWOL,
Mm.
absence without leave. Actually, as I think about it, you can be charged AWOL as a federal employee, but it's not a criminal offense, it's an administrative offense. You don't go to jail, you just get administrative penalties.
Oh, okay. I see.
But in the Army, it's a crime.
Oh, interesting. And is that because I just looked it up? So it says absent without official leave, but without intent to desert.
Right, because
So,
desertion is a separate criminal offense.
oh, I see. And is that a similar thing of like that's only a criminal
Right,
offense within
right.
the Army? Okay. Whoa, so many things. Because you served 7 years in the Army, what led you to then switch to the Department of the Interior?
So I met the person who is now my husband, and I was serving at a time when it was still technically illegal. It was during the Don't Ask, Don't Tell era, but it was technically illegal to be gay
Mm,
and in the Army. And I was navigating that as best I could at the time, and then I
yeah.
met my husband and decided it was increasingly untenable to serve in the Army and have a relationship with a man.
Mm. And did you go straight into the Department of the Interior after
I
that?
didn't. I took a few years off. Yeah. So my husband and I traveled extensively. I took 3 years off.
Wow.
He
Okay.
had some health issues that we wanted to make sure that we sort of worked through, and so I just took some time off and traveled extensively. And in fact, it was during one of those trips that I first visited the Grand Canyon in 1994.
Wow. Okay. And it's interesting to think back on our lives and the circular nature of them. Do you remember anything from that experience of being particularly struck by it? Or it's easier to put that together now and be like, oh, yeah, I did feel this
Oh,
way or
no,
whatnot?
I remember it quite distinctly. So Scott had been to the Grand Canyon before. It was my first visit to the Grand Canyon,
Okay.
and I remember walking up to the rim and having this very powerful sense of the divine. Right? I mean, God exists because the Grand Canyon
Mm,
exists. This is a very spiritual place to the indigenous people who call the Grand Canyon home, and if you're open to it, it's easy to see why. And I was
yeah.
certainly impressed with a sense of the divine, as I said. I also had
Mm,
this really curious random thought that this would be an amazing place to live and work.
And that's particularly interesting because, like you said, you and your husband traveled extensively. So the fact that all these years later sticks out to you is really cool.
I don't remember having that thought anywhere else that we traveled, and we traveled extensively. And then 26 years later, I got a call. Hey, the Secretary of the Interior wants to ask you to be the superintendent of the Grand Canyon.
You're touching on, and I actually remember, or I've just seen that across in preparing for like the Crater Lake interview, just the experience and the ways people experience Crater Lake and its beauty. And I think for me, nature is what I consider a thin place where I feel, closer to the divine. And there's for me, and again, I think it's, if you're open to kind of it being interpreted that way, but it's in those moments where you're in places and you're like, wow, like just the beauty of it kind of overwhelms you. And for me, it points me to be like, wow, this must have, been designed and created. And so it's cool that you felt that like spirituality when you were there.
Right.
What was your experience transitioning back into the Department of the Interior and working as, I presume you went straight into being a lawyer?
Yeah, in 1997, I started up as a staff attorney at the Solicitor's Office of the Department of the Interior, and in the Division of General Law. So I was practicing law in those areas I mentioned earlier, in the suite of administrative law, and it was a fantastic experience. I mean, to begin with, the lawyers in the Solicitor's Office are incredibly talented and shared my commitment to public service. They were, as dedicated as I was to the mission of the Solicitor's Office, and because we had these shared perspectives, we just had a lot of fun. It was just a terrific work environment. It was very collegial, collaborative, and eventually I applied in 2003. I applied for my first SES job, which was the Associate Solicitor for Administration, and that position is effectively the managing partner of the law firm. There are about 450 employees in the solicitor's office. The vast majority of them lawyers, spread across the country from Boston to Anchorage.
And this is those 400 lawyers are still just within the Department of the Interior, right?
Those are the lawyers for the Department of the Interior.
Okay. Wow, that's a lot.
And another reason why I was suited for the Grand Canyon Superintendency, this park is about the same size as the Solicitor's Office. So I managed an organization of 400 plus employees for 17 years, and now I'm managing an organization of 400 plus employees.
Yeah. And so when you said in 2003 you applied, was your role split in a sense? Like you were doing management work, but then also being the deputy solicitor?
No, this is before I became deputy solicitor. So I started out as a staff attorney from 97 to 2003. And then I got my first management job as the associate solicitor for administration. Then after 7 years, so 2010, I lateraled into the associate solicitor for general law. And then in about 2014, I was promoted into the deputy solicitor for general law position. And so when I was the associate solicitor for administration, I was a practicing lawyer, but I didn't have clients. My job was to manage the solicitor's office. And then when I lateraled to the associate solicitor for general law position, I got back into the practice of law.
Okay. And then that's when you kind of had clients again. Okay. And who are clients?
Well, so that's a good question. So when I was the Associate Solicitor for Administration, I helped to clarify who the client was because, sometimes when you're working every day with an individual, say in the National Park Service, who's a management official, you have that working relationship with a human being, and you naturally think of that person as the client. But that's not the client. The client is actually the Department of the Interior, as sort of personified by the management officials within the department who are exercising the authorities of the position. So really the lawyers are mindful to give legal advice on behalf of or to the department, but the department doesn't answer questions like, can we waive a privilege, right? I mean, a human being has to do that. So it's those people who are given the authority within the departmental management structure to exercise those authorities. Those are the people we give legal advice. Those are the people who answer questions like, do we waive privilege, or who make or are authorized to make decisions that they're seeking legal counsel about. I don't know if that helped or if that confused things.
It's a complicated space, but it did help. It gave some clarity to that. I mean, as you were kind of talking about the progression within the Department of the Interior, like you said, it did span a substantial number of years. Are there any initiatives or projects that come to mind that you are particularly proud of?
So I have to say that I was proud of all of the legal work that I did for my client.
That's good.
So nothing sticks out. But as a manager, there were some things that stuck out. So, for example, I particularly proud of the fact that I think I was one of the early adopters and leaders in federal government about allowing for making space for employee-friendly work schedules and flexibilities, such as maxi-flex schedules and remote work opportunities. Years before they became common practice, right? They started becoming common practice during the pandemic, about 16, 15
Right.
years after I started implementing them in the solicitor's office. And so that's one thing that sticks out. Another is that I was responsible for really improving the professionalism of the office in some key areas, including employment law and torts, by centralizing those work. We used to assign personnel cases and tort matters to basically any lawyer in the field. But if those are areas of practice of requiring particular skills and knowledge, so I wound up centralizing those practices, sort of pulling people into the centralized practices. So that's all they did. That's all they do now, and that's really improved our
So
capacity.
they're a little more specialized, maybe.
Yeah, they're specialized and they're more able to keep up with the current trends in the law.
And I had to look up. I was like, I've heard of tort from. I've never taken a law class, so I'm like, where have I heard of it from? Oh, I took a business law class in college, actually. But how does that play out in the Department of the Interior? For folks who, I had to look it up. It's a wrongful act or infringement of a right leading to civil legal
Right.
liability. So, what is that manifestation in the Department of the
So
Interior?
people visit parks, wildlife refuges, national monuments, and injure themselves. And in some cases, they may sue the Department of Interior or the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land
Oh,
Management, for the injuries that they got when they were visiting federal land
oh, interesting.
units, right? So the tort lawyers defend the United States, the Department of the Interior, the National Park Service, against claims for personal injuries while visiting those spaces.
I see. Yeah, that's really cool. I want to be conscious of time, and my curiosity could lead me down a million rabbit holes. But what brought us here today is your current position as Grand Canyon Superintendent. So, kind of switching gears, moving into, first off, thanks for enticing some of my
Yeah, sure.
curiosities within that experience. But moving into the Grand Canyon, I just love to hear over the 4 years when you first started and then now, where do you think your time has been differently spent as you've become more familiar with the park? How has kind of some of the biggest challenges changed over the past 4 years?
So when I got to the park had a strategic plan that had 43 goals. And they were all really good goals. They're things that, relate to the work of the different functional divisions in the park. But when I used to manage the solicitor's office, I used to have this saying I would tell people, you can't have 53 number one priorities, and neither can you have 43 number
Yeah.
one priorities. So I've worked with the leadership team here to distill those priorities to three. And we
Wow.
are managing really closely and effectively to those three priorities. Now, there's a lot of work that goes on in the park that aren't directly tied to those three priorities, and that work is important and it needs to happen regularly and successfully. So, by identifying
Right.
three priorities, I don't mean to diminish the other important work that goes on in the park, but nevertheless, there are opportunities to focus attention. And certainly my
Hmm.
attention as superintendent is spent a lot on these three priorities. They're pretty broad priorities, but they help align what I spend my time on and what other people spend their time on and how we
Right.
collaborate and coordinate within.
Okay. Well, dare I ask, what are the three
Yeah, sure.
priorities?
So the three priorities are indigenous affairs, climate change, and historic preservation and infrastructure. If you want, I can spend a few minutes on, extrapolating on one or all of them.
Yeah. Yeah, I would love that.
So for indigenous affairs, Grand Canyon National Park, like so many other federal land units, was established over 100 years ago against the will of the people who lived here from time immemorial. And once we
Hmm.
established the Park Service did what the Park Service did back then. We removed and kept those people away from their homelands for 100 years. A few years before I became superintendent, the park started rethinking that and started asking the question: how do we welcome indigenous people back into their homelands? Because the truth of the matter is, even though this is a national park and I'm the superintendent and I'm charged by law to manage this place as a national park, that doesn't mean it isn't also the homelands of the 11 associated tribes that call the Grand Canyon home. So the
Hmm.
Indigenous Affairs Initiative is designed to strike the balance of managing the park in a manner that's coherent with welcoming indigenous people back into their homelands. So we're doing a number of things to make that happen. It started with the development of the first intertribal cultural heritage site in the national park system at our east entrance gate at a place called Desert View. Working with our official friends group, the Grand Canyon Conservancy, we raised $6 million to redesign the landscape along a system or a pathway that our tribal partners told us they wanted. So one of the things we did is we established an intertribal working group where the 11 associated tribes appointed people to be working with the park to help us figure this question out. How do we welcome indigenous people back? And so they've developed a strategic plan, and the park is deliberate about listening rather than speaking, or at least listening before we speak, and to follow their guidance. And so we're implementing the strategic plan that our tribal partners have developed. And when I got here, that work had started already. And so when I got briefed about the work we were doing at Desert View, my only question was, why are we only doing this at Desert View? Why aren't we doing this at the rest of the park? So we are now working on the second strategic plan with the Intertribal Working Group that will extend the work we're doing at Desert View to the rest of the park. So that's an example of how we're welcoming Indigenous people back. We're also working to identify co-stewardship opportunities. We're hiring Indigenous people into the green and the gray uniforms. So we're doing a number of things to make that happen.
One question with regards to that is, I just spoke with the glacier superintendent, and they have been in this process of reintroducing bison, and I know that there had been a reintroduction of condors into, I think, Redwood National Park and state parks.
Right.
Are there any animal group species that were once in the Grand Canyon but were forcefully removed? And are there, if you know about, and are there any efforts to potentially reintroduce them?
So we're not having any conversations about reintroducing animals. We are having conversations, including with tribal partners, about managing the bison herd on the North Rim. And there's a question of whether or not they're native or not native, but our Indian tribes associated with the Grand Canyon have bison traditions. So we're working with the Intertribal Bison Buffalo Council, to manage that herd, and with tribal partners. So there's some really good opportunities there.
With regards to climate change, I know you had some thoughts on that also.
Yeah, so climate change is impacting the Grand Canyon National Park. And so we're seeing impacts in three major areas. The first is human health. It perhaps counterintuitively to a number of people, it gets hotter as you hike into the canyon. And as the climate is warming, it's getting harder to start and harder when you finish. And the heat causes it can cause significant injury and even death, heat-related death. We do have people who die in the canyon from heat-related death. We rescue between 300 and 400 people in the canyon every year. Not all of those injuries are heat-related. Some of them are slip and falls and such, but that's a lot of people who are potentially need rescued. So that's one of the issues we're seeing. We have forests on the north and the south rims. The health of the forests are deteriorating, which makes them at greater risk for wildfire. So the superintendent and I have to make really important decisions about managing wildfire fuels. And then the third issue is the health of the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. The water's getting warmer. Lake levels at Lake Powell, which feeds water to the Grand Canyon through the Glen Canyon Dam. As the water levels drop, warmer water is coming through the turbines. So too are non-native invasive predatory fish. We have a federally listed threatened fish called a humpback chub in the Grand Canyon, and so I'm responsible under the Endangered Species Act and the Grand Canyon Protection Act to do what I can to protect those fish. So we've got fish management practices that we're trying to manage too. So those are the three areas that we're focusing on, and I've recently charged staff with developing a comprehensive communications and interpretive climate change strategy so we can understand ourselves and educate our visitors about what the climate change impacts are and what the opportunities are. The park is trying to manage them.
With some of the climate change stuff, as I was reading different articles, I came across one of just learning about this period of, I don't know if I'm saying it right, aridity.
That's right.
And just how kind of the increase, and you can correct me and fill in the gaps of pieces I'm missing with this, but my understanding was as temperatures are rising, it makes the ground hotter, and then so more water is actually being absorbed into the ground rather than within the like river itself, and that's affecting different aspects of the environment. And then I know another like water challenge that I was reading about was the potential development plans kind of in a surrounding community and how that would affect the water level flows in the Grand Canyon. So I'd love to hear, I guess, your thoughts on both just the period of aridity and then the pending development.
Yeah, so you've got aridity, and people also use the word aridification of the soil, right? So the climate basically is baking the soil, and because the soil is
Yeah.
harder, when the snowpack melts, the soil absorbs the snowpack much like a sponge, rather than the snowpack going
Interesting.
into the river system. So 2 years ago, we had about 90% of the snowpack, but something in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% actually got into the river system. So you
Wow.
just need a lot more snow when the ground is hardened in order to allow that snow to get into the river systems. So that's one problem. Another problem is that there's only so much water in the system to begin with. First, back in the 1920s, when
Yeah.
the law of the river was established, the different legal authorities and the compacts and agreements that the upper basin states and the lower basin states have in the Colorado River Basin to allocate water. There was never as much water in the system as was allocated, and that seemed fine for the first 50, 60 years or so. But once the soil started aridifying and the soil started absorbing it, it became a really difficult challenge, which is why we've
Mm.
seen the water levels at Lake Powell and Lake Mead and other lakes in the basin drop so
Oh,
much, because
interesting.
we're still extracting more water than there was ever in the system while there's less water available for it. So
Right.
one of the things I do is I talk to other federal managers about these issues in other bureaus, and I'm the National Park Service representative to the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Working Group, which is a federal advisory committee that helps advise the Secretary of the Interior on how to allocate water through the Glen Canyon Dam. It's a really complex series of factors that go into that, but there's a whole series of federal, state, tribal, environmental, recreational stakeholders who are part of this group that's trying to figure out how to
Mm.
preserve water in the system while we're seeing these climate change impacts. It's a really fascinating process.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Well, a couple things are coming to mind. One, it gives a lot of context into like we see. I live in Texas. I'm not that close to. I mean, maybe somewhat close to Arizona and that area, but we see in the news Lake Powell, Lake Mead, rapidly decreasing levels, and aridity in that process gives context into like why, even if we get a good rainfall year, snow year, why that's continuing to be the case. And then just the challenges that you're saying of we were always at a negative even 50 years ago. And so it's just, I mean, yeah, it's a hard
Yeah.
problem to figure out. And so,
Fortunately, yeah, sure, everybody who's involved in this sees the need to solve the problem, and we get a lot of smart people who are dedicated to trying to solve the problem. There's just a lot of hard choices that we have to make, and so it's going to take time to work through
yeah.
those hard choices.
Yeah. Is that related to the, I guess, proposed development plans? Because that obviously affects just water usage in that area. Like, are those organizations overlapping?
So there is a developer in the town of Tucson, a gateway community to the Grand Canyon National Park, that owns land and wants to develop the land. And they own the land, and they have certain expectations of what they can do with that land, but they have to go
Mm,
through various
yeah.
federal processes in order to develop. Right? They've got to figure out what's the impact of the development of the floodplain, for example. What's the impact on the water table? There are certain hoops that any developer has to go through when you want to build,
Hmm.
so they're going through that process. They've been going through that process for over 30 years and have not yet gotten
Wow.
all of the permissions they need to develop, because there are real challenges that have to be thought
Right.
through, and water is one of the significant challenges that has to be really thought through before clearances are authorized to develop. Fortunately, those
Hmm.
aren't my decisions to make.
Yeah. You're like, you have enough decisions to make. So
Yeah, right.
you don't need to add that. I guess, was there, before we jump into the third strategic focus, was there anything else from the climate change perspective you wanted to touch on?
No, I think that's a good summary. So the third priority is infrastructure, historic property. So many national parks and federal land units have not invested in infrastructure. Grand Canyon National Park has complex water system. We draw our water from the canyon and pump it up to both the north and the south rims.
Oh, whoa.
We have 4 wastewater systems. We have an electrical grid, all of which were designed in the early 70s with a 25-year shelf life. So do the math. And an assumption, yeah, right.
Yeah, 1995.
And an assumption of 2.4 million visitors, 2.5 million visitors. Grand Canyon National Park in 2019, the last full year before the pandemic, had 6.8 million visitors. And,
Yeah,
we dropped
that's a
down to
lot.
2.8 that first year of the pandemic. And we've leveled off since then, the last couple of years at 4.7. But the point is, all of that infrastructure is a good 25, 30 years beyond its shelf life and at least twice to 2.5 times more visitors than we're designed for. And so they're all failing, and they're all failing at the same time. 2 Septembers ago, we had a series of breaches in the pipeline that pumps water to the south rim. And we weren't able to continually feed the water tank farms on the south rim. And so as we used water over the course of a number of weeks, the level of water in the tank farms were dropping precipitously close to the minimum water levels that we've established we need to support structure fire in the park. All right, so if a fire burns down, you need water to put it out.
Oh,
If a fire it starts at a building. So I was probably within 2 to 3 hours of issuing an evacuation order of the South Rim in September.
wow. Oh, because essentially if a fire started, it
That's right.
couldn't
It
be
would have
put
been
out.
unsafe to be in the park.
Wow.
And so that gives you a sense of the urgency to change all of our systems out. So we are in the process of lining up a series of projects. First in the box is we're completely re-electrifying the park, and
Oh,
because all the new systems. So we're also going to replace the Trans Canyon water line and the North Rim infrastructure. So water going to the North Rim and to the South Rim, and the pumps that pumps the water up. We're replacing all of that. We will be replacing all 4 of the wastewater treatment plants in the park and
nice.
some other things in the North Rim that will allow us to reimagine the future of the North Rim. And we can get into that if you're interested. But so the point is, we will spend in the next 5 to 7 years somewhere in the neighborhood to half to $750 million to replace all of that infrastructure because it needs to be replaced. And it needs to be replaced now.
Yeah.
So we are basically a construction zone while we're receiving 4.7 million
Yeah.
visitors and managing all of these projects in a way that's coordinated so we're able to do as much as we can as quickly as we can. On the North Rim, we're replacing
Right.
some of the infrastructure. Right now, we operate 6 months a year on the North Rim. We open in mid-May, close in mid-October, because the infrastructure there is not
Okay.
winterized. So the investments that we're making,
Is that a newer thing that it's
no,
closed
it nope.
during the
It's
Oh,
always
okay.
been like that because the infrastructure is not winterized. So with the infrastructure investment we're making in the North Rim, we'll have the opportunity to reimagine what North Rim operations might look like in the future. So we've
Oh,
begun the
cool.
internal planning for visitor use management plan for North Rim operations, whether to expand the North Rim season, how to expand the North Rim season on either side of the season, on one side of the season,
That's really cool.
maybe going into winter operations. If we go into winter operations, what winter operations do we authorize, right? So we'll be engaging the public on those kinds of questions in the next few years.
Right. What type of, I guess, recreational activities, say it was winterized, what type of recreational activities could people do if they were able to access the North Rim? Or is that part of
Well,
the
so far, I
discovery?
mean, people right now can access the North Rim. So it's a 67-mile ski, right? If you cross country ski, you can ski for 67 miles and get to the North Rim developed area and camp, right? If that's what you want to
Really?
do, you can do that.
That's cool.
You would go from Jacob Lake on Highway 89A,
Okay.
and then you would just hike, you would ski to or snowshoe, right? There's a national forest
Right.
just north of the park, so you'd have to get permission from the forest and the park to do these sorts of things, but you could do that. We just don't have lodging available to support visitors.
I see. I see.
So very few people do that. We want very few people to do that because we don't have the people or resources to support people who are doing that, who can support those kinds of people. So we're looking at, and I don't want to pre-decide anything, but we're looking at where could people cross country ski, where could people snowshoe, and we're asking the other questions. What other kind of winter activities would people want to do out there? So, for example, maybe we would set up a series of yurts where you could ski or snowshoe to and have lunch, or maybe even spend the night or something, right? So lots of possibilities that we're going to explore through this visitor use management program.
Yeah, and what a cool, that's pretty rare that you get to like have those opportunities to be creative and reimagining different aspects. And so that's a cool experience for the folks working at the Grand Canyon to
Yeah,
also have.
right.
We've talked a lot about just some of the different things you're working on. I continue to say this and I continue to believe it's true. Every superintendent has a lot going on. There are a lot of different things to manage. And I guess flipping that to just the opportunities, like you said, you get to see the Grand Canyon every day when you walk to work. But I'd love to hear maybe a favorite experience or two you've had as a visitor in the park, like exploring different trails, maybe rafting, stuff like that.
Sure. Well, my most favorite experience as a visitor was actually as a visitor that first visited in 1994 when I first saw the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
That stands out in my mind.
Yeah.
But since then, there's so many interesting things that I've done in the park since I've been here. I have access to a helicopter and a plane, and I've flown over the Grand Canyon in ways that most people can't. So I've gotten a bird's eye view of the
Right.
Grand Canyon, which is even more remarkable than a view rim of the Grand Canyon. I've been in the river a number of times and had just tremendous experiences on the river, including, this one time that the party I was with set up camps at a beach called Upper Tanner, and we literally had 40-mile-an-hour winds for 40 hours. And I would wake up in the middle of the night with all of my tent flaps closed, with sand on my face,
Oh my
and
gosh.
not being able to sleep because the wind kept flapping the tent. That's when I learned to really embrace the adversity that sometimes being on the river is,
Yeah.
because you're either going to be miserable or you're going to enjoy it.
Yeah.
And I learned to enjoy adversity. You have to embrace adversity, and
Yeah.
once you're able to do that, you can really thoroughly enjoy an experience that is not always easy. And another thing, I'll just
No, that sounds hard, objectively.
but at the same time, fun.
Have you heard the phrase type 2
Yeah,
fun?
right.
That's a type 2 fun. I mean, you're making me think of one of my first experiences on a longer backpacking trip was within Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. And it was our first night of, I think, like a 7 or 8 day trip. It was when I was in college and it was through our outdoor program. And I remember, I don't know how fast the winds were, but I was still new to backpacking. So, like, still camping, I still would get a little nervous being out there, and the winds, there were so many winds, and I just remember feeling like pressed in on the tent. Like the tent would just like literally be on your
Yeah,
face while
yeah,
you're sleeping. And it's
yeah,
humbling. There are moments where like I love it and I seek it out, but then you're like, wow, I'm really happy I have a good steady shelter to go
yeah,
into
yeah,
on
yeah.
occasions.
One experience I'll just end with. I could go on. I try to get into the field as much as I can with staff, and I've had a number of experiences with our geoscience team, including my first experience with them, where we went with a couple of paleontologists and we went fossil huntings. They were showing me
Ooh.
how they use modern tools, including connecting to satellite, to manage the paleontology program in the park. And so they took the group. So it was myself, a deputy superintendent, the chief of science, deputy chief of science. My husband was in the park, so he joined us for this expedition, and then some of these scientists. And they took us to this place where they said, we think there are fossils here, but we haven't explored this yet. So the deputy chief of science and my husband both found fairly large, like a 12-inch wide, maybe not quite 12 inches, 280 million year old fossil of a fern with spores. And they got into this really fun fight about, the
That's
deputy
so
chief
cool.
found hers in two pieces that were perfectly fit together like a puzzle, and Scott found his in one piece that was slightly smaller than hers but was intact. And so we had this fun argument on the way out of the canyon, whose fossil was better. Um,
Like, yeah, like who discovered the more important fossil?
Exactly. So Scott's
That's
now got his
awesome.
name in the scientific record of the Grand Canyon with having found this fossil. So his name will probably be in the record of the Grand Canyon longer
Heck
than
yeah.
mine will.
Yeah, that's awesome. Oh my gosh. Do you have a favorite? This is more of a fun, silly question, but do you have a favorite snack you like to bring? into the park when you're going camping or
Yeah, I
hiking?
do. So the park advises people to bring salty snacks in addition to water because we have to replenish the salts that we sweat when we're exerting, right?
Mm, when you're
So
in
we
that
encourage people
heat.
to bring salty
Yeah.
snacks. I happen to have a sweet tooth, so I've managed to combine my sweet tooth with the need to have salty snacks, and I always grab payday candy bars because it's a good mixture of salt and sweet.
Ooh. Okay. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these energy or whatever protein bars are like candy anyway. So I like that you're going
Yeah,
straight to the source and just
yeah.
taking candy. So very good. I applaud that. I know there are many areas that I've really enjoyed hearing from you, and areas that I could continue to go into deeper holes. I have one more question and then I guess two more questions. Kind of like one I'm curious about, and then a way that I wrap up
Uh,
every interview. But the first is I've personally really enjoyed learning about the different education programs in the parks. Part of it is I think the younger you can get people caring about our national parks, the better. What education programs does the Grand Canyon have for either kids or students that really stick out to you?
Yeah, so we do a number of things. So first, we invite schools to come to the park, local schools primarily, but we get schools from Phoenix
Cool.
who bus up here, and then we have interpretive rangers who spend time with them and introduce them to the park. You know, fossils, wildlife, geology, history, indigenous experience, that sort of thing. We also send our interpretive rangers to schools to talk to people about the park, and they'll
Oh,
bring
cool.
artifacts with them as they do that. And we also have really great studio where interpretive rangers can connect to classrooms literally around the world by Zoom or other platforms, and we've with a green screen that they control the visuals in the background, talk about the Grand Canyon to kids across the globe. So really great stuff.
Wow.
That resource was funded by our official friends groups, the Grand Canyon Conservancy,
Mm.
and the Grand Canyon Conservancy also hosts and sponsors artists and astronomer in residence who come here right now. I just met
Oh.
the current astronomer in residence who started this weekend, and we I think we're the last park in the system with a K through 12 school. So we connect with the school
Oh.
with park programming like the artist and astronomer in residence programs, and we're just beginning to talk with the school about maybe partnering with them to think about a youth field institute where youth from across the country, maybe internationally, can come into the park and have a Grand Canyon experience that's managed with the park, the conservancy, maybe the school, maybe some other partner organization. So we're doing a lot of really cool stuff, and we're thinking a lot about what else we can do in that space because it's important for us to connect with the next generation of park visitors
Yeah.
and park employees.
Yeah, who was I talking? It was the glacier superintendent, and he was talking about they have this program called the Glacier Institute, and he kind of not offhandedly, but was like, I mean, it's helping identify the future superintendents. Like, you have to care about the parks to go into that type of work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that
that's cool.
population and also the population of lawyers. We've now opened that door.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The way that I like to close out every interview is just with the question of if someone has or has not been to the Grand Canyon, what is something you wish that everyone knew
Yeah,
about
that's
the
a
Grand
really good
Canyon?
question. So Kevin Federico is an author who wrote this wonderful book called The Emerald Mile. It's about the fastest river run in the history of the canyon. He has a new book coming out, and I had the opportunity to review it. It's about his traverse of the 277-mile canyon, and it's a really good book. And he has this great factoid in the book. We like to say that the Grand Canyon National Park is larger than Rhode Island. We're at 1.2 million acres.
Wow.
Kevin's factoid is if you were able to flatten the Grand Canyon, it would be larger than the state of Texas. Yeah, I think that's really, really
Wow.
interesting. So this is a large.
And Texas is big.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Just ask a
just
Texan.
I live in
Yeah,
Austin,
yeah,
and let me tell you, it takes a long time to drive out
yeah.
of
Scott's
Texas.
family is in Austin, and I have a brother who lives in El Paso. And so we went from Austin to visit my brother in El
Oh,
Paso.
cool.
It took us a day and a half to get there.
Yeah.
I can drive
Uh-huh.
from Washington D.C. to the Canadian border, where Scott and I have a cabin on the Canadian border in like 8 hours, 8 to 10 hours, depending on who's
Yeah.
driving. Anyway,
Yeah. Don't I know it?
so, this is a large and complex place. We have 7 separate climate zones in the park. The canyon looks timeless.
Wow.
an even static. You look at it and it looks like it's always been here. So because it looks
Yeah.
timeless and static, it looks like it's safe and effortless to maintain. And the truth of the matter is the canyon is constantly changing with erosion and climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be a dangerous place if you're not paying attention to it. It's also a constant challenge to preserve and to make available to our visitors, right? Those are the two missions of the National Park Service: preserve
Yeah.
and make available to visitors. So, I guess what I would say about something I wish everybody knew about the Grand Canyon is that the park staff here are truly remarkably talented and dedicated people. I wish everyone knew just how much work it is to keep this place going and how well the staff here does this important work.
Yeah. I mean, that in itself is the journey I'm on with this podcast, is bringing to light to just, people outside of the parks. I think anyone who works in the Park Service is aware of that. Anyone who works in public land management is aware of that. But I wasn't aware of that before I started on this journey. And so it's kind of bringing it to the people of these timeless places. Actually, it is incomprehensible how much work and how much heart and dedication goes into protecting them.
Right.
So thanks for saying that. Yeah, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for your interest. This is a really cool podcast you're doing. I've in preparation for the interview, I looked at a number of podcasts, listened to them. It's really interesting stuff, and
Thanks.
I commend you for your interest, and I hope you're really tapping into a real interest that is out there with the public.
That's the hope. Yeah, thanks, Ed. Thanks so much for listening today. Our music was composed by Danielle Bees. If you liked this podcast, rate, review, download, and tell your friends about it. This ensures the stories of our national parks and how they are run are shared. Listen to the other episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts, or visit us at whorunsThisPark.com to learn more. I'm Maddie Pellman, and you've been listening to Who Runs This Park.